What is our next main topic today?
Next one by Roger Barth. I was reading about the industry projections today, and they're now saying that Avengers Endgame will not catch Star Wars The Force Awakens for the #1 all-time domestic box office record. How is this even remotely possible? It was the biggest domestic opening by a mile at $357 million, way more than Star Wars $247 million. And it's an awesome movie. How on earth does this happen, and are they wrong?
Okay, so first of all, no, the projections aren't wrong. And we've actually been talking about this a little bit around the show. Right now, they're projecting that Endgame will probably end its domestic run somewhere around the $850 million range. Wrap your head around that number. 850. Most movies and filmmakers would kill their own mothers to have a film that makes $850 million worldwide. Endgame, they're projecting now is going to come in at $850 million. That ain't worldwide. That's just here at home. That's just domestically. It would be the second biggest domestic thing of all time. It is a staggering, momentous accomplishment. It is huge. But what have I been telling you guys? I've been telling you that the moment there's any record that Endgame doesn't accomplish, it doesn't matter that it's the biggest film we've seen in theaters in a decade. It doesn't matter if it becomes like the second biggest domestic grossing film of all time. It won't matter. What have I told you? I have said, you watch, the moment there's some record it doesn't catch, the boo birds are going to start coming out and start talking about, oh, Endgame failed. Well, let's take a look at an outlet that I actually really like quite a bit. I like this outlet a lot, IndieWire, which is great. I love IndieWire. IndieWire is fantastic. But I'm going to pick on them and throw them under the bus here a little bit right now. What's the headline they run? Yes, Avengers Endgame's box office was massive, but it fell short of expectations. What the hell kind of expectations did you have that $850 million domestic is short of expectation? Shut up. Just shut up. Now, if you want to say that it fell short of the expectations that a lot of us had once we saw Endgame's opening weekend, well, then you're not wrong, because like the truth of the matter is, Rob, when the opening weekend for Avengers Endgame came out and it made that ridiculous $357 million opening weekend, devastating the previous record by miles, the song and dance from everybody became, oh, it's going to beat all the records in like 2.5 weeks. It's now it's not a question about whether it's going to catch Avatar. The question is, how much over $3 billion will it make? And now it looks like it's not going to get to $3 billion at all. Still projected to beat Avatar, by the way. It'll barely crawl over that finish line, but I still think it's going to get there. Still possible it won't, but I think it will. And it's like, oh my gosh, forget the Force Awakens domestic record. It's going to be like $1.2 billion at home. Granted, yes, at the time when that opening weekend number came out, everybody was like, this thing's going to make, I even saw some people saying the movie's going to make $4 billion. All right, so but $3 billion was a foregone conclusion. Well, yes, if you want to say on opening weekend, a bunch of people created some completely unrealistic expectations, sure, that's fine. But I told you before, the moment this thing misses one record, the boo birds are going to come out saying, oh, what went wrong? What a failure. Never mind the fact it's one of the most successful films of all time. But to go to their point, though, they did bring up a couple of interesting things in that IndieWire article. Let's read this, because this makes a lot of sense. This is, again, from that IndieWire article. When it opened, talking about Avengers Endgame, at $357 million, that represented 89% of the total for all films in theaters that weekend. That's impressive. At an all-time high, it had more theaters and more total screens and seats than any film in history, with showtimes covering at least 18 hours a day for the first weekend. However, and this is key, that strategy also led to a much shorter shelf life. Based on an $850 million domestic final gross, 91% of its total will come through its fourth weekend. In the 21st century, 80% was the fourth weekend norm. Black Panther hit that mark at 80%, while Force Awakens was 87% and Infinity War was 88%. Rob, one of the things that we have been saying for a while and been trying to drum down is that, look, one of the things we got to keep in mind here is that there are a couple of changing trends over the last couple of years in movies. Number one, as this article just pointed out, more and more people are going to the movies earlier and earlier in their release. Particularly event films. People want to see it opening weekend. Most people don't wait for the second weekend or the third weekend. They go early. They go front heavy. By Endgame, opening in more theaters than any other movie ever did, by opening with more theater seats available than any other movie did, by running more 24-hour screenings than any other movie did, they made it possible for more and more people to cram into that opening weekend, but that meant more people have seen it already. So even though this was an interesting number, you know, Endgame comes out and breaks the opening weekend box office record by over $100 million, but by weekend 4, it was only the 5th biggest fourth weekend in movie history. Wow, that must mean people didn't like it since it dropped. No, it just means that everybody went to go see it 2, 3, 4 times in its opening weekend. That's all. That's what it means. It doesn't mean people didn't like it. It doesn't mean it didn't have legs. It doesn't mean any of that. The only point I think here to make is the fact that so many people got out to see it right away that it creates this false impression that later on it somehow fell off or it somehow had failure. No, it just front end loaded, which is becoming the growing trend here, Rob. So look, I look at this and I think a lot of people to this day underestimate just how big $900+ million domestically alone it is for The Force Awakens. That is an incredibly unheard of number that did that. So Rob, let me ask you this question. What do you think is the story here? Like with Endgame not going to catch the domestic box office record, I still think it'll catch the worldwide one, which is the more important record, by the way, in my opinion. But is the story here that Endgame didn't have enough legs to make the domestic record? Or do you think the story here is we just need to really reevaluate how much we appreciate that record that The Force Awakens has? How do you see it?
I think there's something else to think about. Okay, let's say your local movie theater is open from 12 o'clock in the afternoon to 12 o'clock at night. All right? And you're showing both Star Wars The Force Awakens and you're showing Endgame. The Force Awakens is 2 hours and 25 minutes. Endgame's 3 hours. That means for the same amount of time, Endgame only gets to be shown 4 times, and Force Awakens gets to be shown 5 times. Now that's every single theater that you're talking about. So from a mathematics perspective, I mean, I don't know in terms of theater numbers, but in terms of each theater showing Force Awakens, they had more showings every day than Endgame did, which means another admission was paid for in the same amount of time for Force Awakens that was paid for Endgame. And that's going to accumulate. That's going to be, I'll bet you, if you wanted to say, okay, if we had 5 showings every day of, say, Endgame, and then 5 showings every day of Force Awakens, I'll bet you Endgame might have caught Force Awakens' domestic box office. But that's the reason why Endgame's numbers have gone down. It's a longer film, so there's less showings every day.
Yeah, but I don't know that I agree with you on that. And I agree with that when we're talking about opening weekend, but that's assuming that if we had more showings, more people would go. That's assuming that all the other showings are sold out. The fact of the matter is, in the last number of weeks, there have been plenty of empty seats that people want to go see.
But that was true of Force Awakens, too. I mean, I think what you're saying about front-loading the movies, even in the last 5 years, movie-going trends have changed. But I do think that that's something that isn't taken into consideration, that over the long haul, over 4 weeks, that extra showing adds up to a lot of money.
If they're sold out. If they're sold out.
Like, but even if they're not sold out, you're still getting more. You're still getting another showing worth of admissions.
Well,
because
I disagree, because you're saying another show worth of admission. But what I'm saying is, let's say you have that 5th screening. I'm saying those people who would have gone to the 5th screening, there were plenty of empty seats in the other 4 that they can still go. You're saying,
right, but that's true all the time.
I agree, but that's suggesting that by having the extra screening, more people would have come, and I don't think an opening weekend that's different when all the other screenings are sold out, and you needed those extra seats of another screening for more people to go.
Right,
but in the subsequent weeks when there've been empty seats, I don't think that applies.
But I think it's the time. Look, it's a time when people go to the movies. I mean, I think if Force Awakens, if there's, say, a 10 o'clock show of Force Awakens, and there's only a 9 o'clock show of Endgame, that there are people that get off work, that it doesn't matter whether the screenings are full or not, it's when people are going to the movies. And I think that it would be the same amount of people, it would just be there would be another showing to go to. And so with Endgame, with the 3-hour running time, you're only giving people so many choices. So as the film plays out, I do think having more screens and more time to see the movie, there'd be more people going on a day that Force Awakens is playing because you get a later show.
I don't know, man, because like, look, even in its fourth week, at the beginning of its fourth week, not now, but at the beginning of its fourth week, Endgame was still on 4,000 screens,
Sure.
which is more screens than any other film in history going into its fourth week. So it had plenty of available screenings. I mean, plenty.
Sure, but it had one less. In those 4,000 theaters, one less available screening than it would have had for
but
Force
that's
Awakens.
compensated for by the extra screens. I mean, so I just don't know. Like, to me, the bottom line is this, is that the difference here is that when The Force Awakens came out, even just a few years ago, they didn't run 24 hours as much as they will now.
Right.
They didn't take over more and more screens as much as they do now. And at the time, even though it was just a couple of years ago, people were more like, I don't have to see it opening weekend. I can go see it on weekend 2, or I can go see it on weekend 3. I can wait. And you see it stretched out a little bit more. Whereas with Endgame, it's such an event, and they added so many more screenings, and they ran it 24 hours that everybody was like, I gotta see it opening weekend. And
You don't
that's
think
why,
that was the case with Force Awakens, though?
not as much,
Star Wars?
not as much of a degree. I think that's been a changing trend with our culture. Not to the same degree. They didn't open it up on as many screens. They didn't run it on 24 hours as much as they did with Endgame. And there were more people at the time because it wasn't as much of our tendency. The patterns weren't as much of our tendency as they pointed out in the IndieWire article to go front weekend. Was there that excitement? Yes. But not as many people were doing it as we do now. And I think that's going to be a trend we see continuing moving forward and all that.